Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Animal-Based Dad podcast. This is the show where between my guest interviews with subject matter experts and topic-specific deep dives, the aim is to arm you with actionable insights and information on how to prioritize your metabolic health and improve your overall health and well-being. Hey, what's up everyone? So I'm doing something a little bit different this week. I'm going to skip all of my usual brand association and advertising associated to my work as a Zinzino independent partner. You see, this week is a bit special. My guest this week is the fantastic Neill Friedman, and I want to plug the GoFundMe which myself and Martin Gillespie have set up to help Neill realize his ambitions of completing his PhD, completing his research project associated to that PhD. And it's all to do with the effects of chronic glucose exposure on our mitochondria. So a really important piece of research work, not just for Neill to get his PhD, but the thing that stood out to me was the potential implications that kind of research can have long term. And the reason I like it so much is because when you stop to think a little bit, it's really the research like that where the potential to change public policy comes in. For all the health coaches, for all the online influencers, for all the people, qualified or not, talking about the stuff that we're doing in the metabolic health space, that's all fantastic and I love it and I partake in it and I have a passion for that. But it is really the people in the labs doing the experimental research that has the potential to move public policy and to change public policy, and that's why I think what Neill is doing is so important. That's why I love what he's doing so much. It's why I first put forward the idea of setting up the GoFundMe to try and help him see this through, because he's self-funded. As you can imagine, there's no food companies, there's no big pharma, there's no one bankrolling the studies that potentially result in them losing business, because there's no profit in telling people to eat healthier, to eat whole foods, to stay away from processed and ultra-processed foods, and to eat in line with their species, which results in them eating less often. There's not much profit in that, so you don't have big corporate entities lining up to fund Neill's research project. It's just not the reality. So I want to ask you to please listen to this interview, to please listen to Neill speak, listen to the passion that the man has for the subject area, to then go to the link that I've included in the show notes for his GoFundMe. Neill has included a detailed video in there where he talks about the research project, what he's doing, what it includes, what it involves. And I want to ask you from the bottom of my heart to please donate towards that GoFundMe, whether it's £5, whether it's £10, whether it's a larger amount or a smaller amount. Every single donation helps, and every single donation is truly appreciated. So yeah, this episode's not about me, it's not about my brand, it's not about me trying to do anything. This is about Neill. Please help and support Neill, and donate whatever you can, whatever you can spare. No amount is too large, no amount is too small. Every single donation is truly appreciated. Let's help Neill complete this research project, and then let's hopefully see the positive impacts down the line, because it's this kind of research that is used to inform public policy. And can you imagine how quickly and effectively we would shift the needle in the fight against chronic disease if research projects like this, research projects that get people eating in line with their species and understanding the impacts that chronic glucose exposure has on their metabolic health at the most fundamental, the most minute level, which is the impact it has on the mitochondria itself. Can you just imagine the downstream ramifications of that in terms of positive change for people's health and well-being? So please donate, it would be truly appreciated. Thanks everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Animal-Based Dad podcast. I'm your host, Ricky Duplessis. My guest today is Mr. Neill Friedman, a man that I've been connected through other connections of mine who are in the metabolic health and wellness space, and whose work I've started to pay very close attention to. I'll let him introduce what he does. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and it's something that I hope will start to gain more and more momentum in the coming years because of how foundational and critical it is to human health and well-being overall. Mr. Friedman, welcome to the show, sir.
Ricky, how are you? It's been a long time since anyone's called me Mr. Friedman, and I'm sure your listeners and your viewers are going to really enjoy this accent combination between the two of us.
Oh man.
Um, they'll just say we're all South African, but I know I'm a Cape Town boy, and you know you're an Natal boy, and the accents aren't quite the same.
No,
Uh, yes,
but
yeah, just to introduce myself, I said my name is Neil. Um, I've gone through my own personal journey. I'm sure that over the course of our conversation, we'll probably go through that. But the journey led me into an academic environment after going through my own health scare and etc. A couple of years ago. And that took me firstly through a undergrad degree in sports and exercise science, for the focus on nutrition and the nutrition side of things. And I am now coming to the end of my third year of a hopefully 5, possibly 6 year PhD, where my area of fascination has become down to bioenergetics, or the functioning of the mitochondria within all of our cells. Um, it's a huge subject. I believe that the mitochondria are, for want of a better word, our CPUs. I think that everything that we experience in the world, our entire interaction with the world, filters down through a series of chemical and electrical pathways through our system, our multicellular organism that we are.
mhm,
And ultimately, those signals become a chemical and electrical signal that our mitochondria interpret and they respond to, and then start a cascade of signals going back in the other direction that then reflects how we think, how we act, how we perceive the world. So I really think that our mitochondria sit at the center of that. And I believe people talk a lot about mitochondrial function and dysfunction. I have quite a strong view on the fact that I don't believe that mitochondria can dysfunction. I think our
okay,
mitochondria are constantly functioning, but they're being forced to function in the environment in which we make them function. And that very
that's an
often that
interesting view.
environment, yeah, so very often that environment is a toxic environment, and
Mhm,
what we think of as dysfunctional mitochondria are actually mitochondria trying desperately to do their job in a toxic environment. So with that in mind, there everything is a stimulus. Everything comes in, and for a PhD, you can't look at everything.
mhm,
So I've taken my pet subject, which is the chronic amount of sugar that we are exposed to, particularly those
yeah.
sugars that break down to glucose in the body. And my specific PhD is therefore looking at how chronic glucose exposure has the ability to reprogram our mitochondria, and
Mhm,
how that reprogramming affects our ability to deal with a challenge. I will say that the event that spurred me into that way of thinking, that made me wanting to start questioning all of this, was during the height of the Delta wave of COVID.
mhm,
I read a study. I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was well above 75. So something like 75% of the corpses on the autopsy table here in the UK who had been diagnosed as having died from COVID were also
mhm,
diagnosed as being diabetic. However,
mhm,
most of those people had not been diagnosed as being diabetic while they were alive. The
mhm,
diabetic diagnosis came about while they were being autopsied. So I thought, to me, that was very clearly showing that something about somebody who's insulin resistant, or somebody who's
mhm.
not responding properly to or dealing with glucose, was making them challenge them in a way that made it harder for them to fight the virus.
Yeah,
And that's why they were the ones most likely to succumb to the virus. And that
cool.
started the questioning, and that's when I kind of got into understanding the whole inflammation cycle, and the pro-inflammation and the anti-inflammation cycle. And just to kind of end off this introduction, what I'll kind of leave you with is what's part of my thinking, and it's something that weirdly I think that all our grandmothers knew,
Hmm.
and that was the inflammation cycle and how it's supposed to work, and potentially how sugar
Hmm.
is not making it work. So just to put that into captions, how many people listening to this remember their grandparents saying to them, "You feed a cold and you starve a fever"? Um,
Mm.
and if you think of the cold and the fever as the inflammation, the anti-inflammatory cycle, basically you get a virus, you get a bug, you get an ill, you get a cold, you get a flu. Your body then starts, it needs to kill that toxin. So it needs to start what's called an M1 or pro-inflammatory cycle, right? And
Hmm.
that needs energy. Needs massive amounts of energy. So you feed that. All right.
Mm.
And that gives you the energy for the fever. Getting hot and sweaty is a very energy intense process. And that's this M1 cycle. That's pro-inflammation. And that's designed to kill off the bugs. I always say that's like
Yeah.
sending in the military, right? You send in the
Yeah.
army and it just goes and kills everything in sight. But what you then need to do is you need to get to a point where you say, right, the enemy's dead. Now what we need to do is remove the army, because the
You
army
need
is
to
no good
switch
at
it
making
off.
us better. And you need to go into an M2 state, or an anti-inflammatory state. And that's when the healing takes place. That's anti-inflammatory, and that is not glycolytic. That's oxphos, that's respiration, that's mitochondrial function.
Hmm.
And that's when you get CD207 and these things that are used to heal tissues and make us better, right? And the
Hmm.
trigger, the switch for going from M1 to M2 is when the energy supply runs out. So you basically feed the cold, drive the inflammation, and then you starve the fever. When you're at that fever point, you take away the food source and all that energy
Hmm.
runs out. And that switches us, that drop in energy switches us from pro-inflammatory to anti-inflammatory. That's the way the
Okay.
cycle's supposed to. I believe that when we are chronically exposing ourselves to sugar in our diets, that signal, that switch from M1 to M2 becomes faulty.
Yeah.
The mitochondria get reprogrammed in such a way that they miss that trigger. So when people spoke about people dying in COVID, they spoke about the cytokine storm. When we see people
Mm.
dying of sepsis in half of sepsis cases, we see this runaway pro-inflammatory effect. It's not the bug that's
Mm.
killing us; it's our own immune system. It becomes inflamed, and we don't switch from pro-inflammatory to anti-inflammatory.
Yeah.
We're missing that signal. And we're missing that signal because we've got so much circulating sugar in our blood that there's something happening that's causing that signal to miss. And that's what I'm trying to look at for my PhD uh, at a cellular level, at an organelle level.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, Neil. Thank you. That's incredibly interesting. Before I move on to the questions that I want to ask you, and I've got a couple based on what you've just said now. Um, for the audience, I just want to go back to what mitochondria are and paraphrase that, and please keep me honest here. But within our cells, we sort of, if you go back to primary school biology, you're taught that your cell has a nucleus and like little bits and pieces. What you're not taught is within the cell itself, you've got these little, what would you call them?
Organelles, if you want to be
Organelles.
technically
Cool.
correct. Organelles. Yeah.
Cool. Perfect. So they subcellular particles within the cells themselves, and they float around and they sort of do a function. And traditionally, they thought of as just the energy plant. I think that's how I first came across them. They were referred to as the battery or the factory of the cell. Um, but as you've alluded to there, they are responsible for interpreting and then switching and doing various sort of hormonal and chemical and electrical functions. So they receive signals as you've described there, and then based on what's going on, they also then turn on the cascade of the sort of response to whatever's happening. So they're small particles of an individual cell that are incredibly important to the function of each and every individual cell.
So it might be worth having a brief capture of some of the what we believe is, or what most of us, a lot of us, plenty of us think believe is the evolutionary cycle of how this all happened. Because, of course, the thing with evolution, we're going back hundreds of thousands of years, is we can only speculate. Because
Yeah.
short of having a DeLorean and Doc Brown, we can't really go back and be sure, right?
Yeah.
But what we think is that as through the evolution of life on Earth. At some point, we had two bacterial type environments, bacteria and something called an archaea, which is an ancient bacteria. And at some point we saw a symbiotic relationship where a bacteria and an archaea joined forces, and the bacteria component derived the energy, or so the archaea didn't need to create its own energy source. The bacteria did that, and the archaea did the other life functions. And over evolutionary times, at some point, the archaea actually enveloped the bacteria. So the bacteria actually became an internal component of the archaea. And that's what then became the eukaryote cell, right? So it developed a nucleus. And this little bacteria, with this external bacteria, now became these organelles inside the archaea, which today we would now refer to as our mitochondria. And so we have something called, and I'm going to get the acronym right, it's called the LUCA, which is the last universal common ancestor, which would be the very first eukaryotic cell. And then from that, we then saw this evolution of eventually multicellular organisms, of which we are one. All right.
Okay.
And these little bacteria, so these organelles inside us, these mitochondria, were once bacteria. And interestingly, when they're sitting inside of our cells, we've learned to live with them. But when they escape our cells, when our cells break up, very often our bodies still see these as a bacteria and actually will initiate an immune response, which is part of the signaling cascade that we are supposed to have. So one of the key things about mitochondria, other than the fact that they're just the powerhouse of the cell, the batteries of the cell, which we're all taught about at school, as you pointed out, and I said they are this central signaling cascade, but they're also the part of that central signaling is the signal for cell destruction. All right. So cytochrome C, which is part of mitochondria, when cytochrome C escapes the mitochondria into the cytoplasm of the cell, that then becomes the trigger that there's something wrong within that cell. And if enough mitochondria, because we don't just have one mitochondrion, singular mitochondrion, we don't just have one mitochondrion in our cell. We have up to hundreds of thousands in a female egg cell, to lesser amounts. When they build up enough cytochrome C escaping, and that then escapes the actual cell itself, that's the signal for cell destruction. All right. That starts the orgosomes and the phagosomes that come in and they break up the cell. If you really want to hear about that or read about that on a very scientific level, very interesting level, I highly recommend a book by Nick Lane. Nick Lane's a science author, and he's got a book called Power, Sex, Suicide, which is the story of mitochondria. It's sitting behind me in the bookshelf here somewhere. But that's the suicide part is what he's talking about there. And that's a very, very important function for health. I think we need to understand that one of the most important things that our cells do, if we talk about it, and let's leave politics aside, but let's be political. The ultimate socialist society is an organism, a multicellular organism, right? All the cells work for the greater good of the entire organism. If a cell starts to realize or starts to give off the signaling that something is not right, it marks itself for self-destruction, right? But we do get cells that become mutated and then actually switch off. And as soon as we have a cell that stops being part of the organism, is not being a socialist and thinking of the greater good for the organism, it starts to think of itself. That's what we call cancer, right? That's a cancerous cell. So what a cancerous cell does is it overrides the cytochrome C release, it overrides the signaling for cell destruction, and rather continues to grow.
And grows at an exponential rate, if I've understood correctly.
Yeah, eventually. So it starts to just protect itself. It starts to then energize and grow itself. Then it starts to grow its environment. So what does it do? It starts to drive something called angiogenesis. In other words, it looks to drive the development of the blood vessels around it. Why? Because it wants to get all the energy sources it can towards itself. And continues its growth. And once it's got itself nice and firmly established and it's managed to drive off the immune system that's around it, then we get to the point of metastasis. That's when then cancer starts to spread. that's when we start to talk about stage 4 cancer, and when
Yeah.
it's now becoming greater than just the single tumor.
Mm.
But all of that is the overriding of the mitochondria. The cell has then overridden a lot of the mitochondrial function,
Very
um,
interesting.
which which is why cancer cells tend not to respire, right? They ferment, they use sugar, they use
Yeah.
glucose.
Now,
The Warburg
you say
effect.
tend, and this is actually, I've come across a lot of Thomas Seyfried's work and hugely admire his work. My dad and my grandfather are both prostate cancer survivors. So genetically speaking, I think all the right triggers are in place within our family line, and it's in my interest to pay very close attention to cancer prevention and make sure that I'm doing whatever I can within my lifestyle to minimize my chances of getting it. Now, Thomas Seyfried will stand quite firm in saying that a cancer cell cannot use beta oxidation, it can only ferment. Is that accurate, or how, do you find?
I'm going to say that there is scientific discord on the subject.
Okay.
So there have been more and more studies that I've seen lately that have kind of indicated that while cancer cells choose to ferment, they choose to do it, if you deprive them completely of sugars, they will potentially find another way. So they might potentially respire, or it might be oxidase, but they might also use glutamate, or they might use other sources of energy as an alternative to the fermentation. I will say
Okay.
that I've seen 1 or 2 studies. There's a lot of debate around this. I think, and this is now my personal opinion rather than any form of
Hmm.
scientific fact, I think it depends on stage of the cancer.
Okay.
So I think in the early stages, if you can deprive the cancers of sugar, and you deprive its ability to ferment, I think you can stop it in its tracks along with traditional means.
Hmm.
I'm not one of these people that says you should never have chemotherapy and all of these things. I think lifestyle interventions sit alongside the traditional medical interventions,
Yep.
and in fact support them in many, many ways. But I think you can do that. But I do think that once a group of cancer cells have reached a certain point, I think that just depriving them of sugar, I think but they will find another way. They'll try to
Okay.
find another way.
That makes
So,
sense, because I think the thing that Thomas Seyfried advocates is to restrict both glucose, blood glucose, and glutamine. And I think it's the two in tandem which potentially are the two routes for cancer cell growth.
but potentially it could also be lactate, right? So we could be producing lactate. So lactate's a fuel as well. People tend to forget that. So, so yeah. So I think, and I also think it goes from cancer to cancer and the individual. So I think one thing I will say is biology is not simple. And the more I've studied it, the more I can say that, we have so much built-in redundancy in our systems,
Mm.
in our genetics, in everything, that every time we say, oh, if we just block this pathway, we'll cure this, we'll fix that. And then we find, well, we block that pathway, and then there's 7 other pathways that step in, right? So
Yeah.
it's not critical. I am going to take you I'm going to be a bit controversial here. You were
Mm.
talking about you doing everything you possibly can to prevent prostate cancer. Do you know
Mhm.
about the 21 times a month?
No, do fill me in.
Have you heard of it? Are you there? Have you
Yeah, yeah, no, man, I'm here.
Sorry, I lost signal. So I was just saying, in terms of doing anything to prevent prostate cancer, have you heard about the 21 times a month?
No, what is that?
Right. So here we go. This is going to be controversial for your viewers. Right. So our bodies produce, or our cells in our mitochondria, we produce citrate. And
Okay.
citrate is a product that we know when it accumulates, it can drive cancers.
Mhm.
And so we get rid of it out of our cells, any accumulation quite quickly. But there's one group of cells that doesn't do that. All right. There's one group of cells that actually uses citrate as a fuel. And it's the only cell that we know of that uses citrate as a fuel, and that's sperm cells. So
Okay.
our sperm cells power themselves, if you like, using citrate in order to go swimming up the fallopian tube, to do that. So in our prostrates, where sperm is being produced, we see an accumulation of citrate being
Okay.
used there. And a great study was done, and it seems to have been supported quite a few times. And it comes down to this magical number of 21, that the best way a man can reduce his chances as he ages of getting prostate cancer is to ejaculate 21 times a month. Um,
There's going to be
all right,
some
and
unhappy married ladies listening to this.
you don't have to do it with a lady, right? Right. So, but yeah, but I know you love to research the evidence. Go look at the evidence. There's some pretty good ones. And for some reason
Yeah.
or other, 21 times a month seems to be the magical number. You can significantly reduce your risk of getting prostate cancer as you age if you ejaculate a minimum of 21 times a month. So there you go, ladies. You've got to do your
Interesting.
husbands a medical favor. Uh,
Yeah, it's important for health and longevity, you see.
Yeah, but absolutely. But as I know you like to do your homework. Go have a look. There's some great work on that subject.
That's very interesting. I will do that, and I will include some references in the show notes. I think that'll be worthwhile doing. Married men, come on, guys, we got to stand firm together, yeah.
Firm being the operative word. Right, moving on.
Oh, brilliant stuff, brilliant
Uh,
stuff. Neill, that's absolutely fascinating. So for the audience, I talk a lot about metabolic health, and in part it's the same thing, but it's taking it sort of a level higher to make it a more simplified view. So when I talk about metabolic health, I'm talking about health at a cellular level, not specifically any particular part of the cell, but the cell overall, if we were to conceptualize it that way. And my theory being that if you look after your health at the level of the individual cell, you then by default will be looking after your health at the level of the individual organ, the system the organ is part of, so on and so forth, until you make up the whole of yourself. So it's, for me, at a layman's level, the foundational basis of what it is to be healthy. And it can, of course, go far deeper than that, as you've just demonstrated, because you can dissect the individual cell and get into the little bits and pieces that make it up, and the mitochondria, et cetera, et cetera. But I think for the general public, it's probably easier to digest to keep it at the level of the cell. So I talk a lot about metabolic health, and I want to ask you, what does metabolic health mean to you, and what do you do as part of your lifestyle to look after your own?
all right. I think that's a great question because whilst I agree with you that we can go really, really deep into cellular metabolic health, I also think we can go upwards. So I define for myself the metabolic health as being the combination of all the chemical pathways that go from the point of view of once we take in something, be that
Mm-hmm.
food, oxygen, water, all the pathways that go down to breaking that down and metabolizing that food,
Mm-hmm.
turning it into an energy source, and then the chemical pathways that make the whole that allow us to use that chemical source ATP
Mm.
for all our functions and for living. So I think that for me, metabolic health is the total process, and that means
Yeah.
everything from the amylase that builds up in our mouth when we eat carbs specifically, right down through that whole digestive process, including the gut bacteria and the whole microbiome. Um, how all of that feeds through our bloodstream, through our organs, coming down to the cells and the mitochondria. So for me, that's it's a big picture
Mm-hmm.
getting smaller. And I'm a very, very big believer in the concept of fractals. And I'm not a big believer. I think we know about what fractals are, but I think that it's in our system. So fractals is just that we see recurring patterns over and over again. And you
Yeah.
look at something very complicated and you see how it works. And when you break it down, you see that every component within that seems to work the same way. And then you look deep and and we just see these repeating patterns from big
Yeah.
macro scale all the way down to tiny micro scale. So I believe that metabolic health is trying to optimize all of that, making sure
Mm.
all of that is working together. Leveraging the socialist society that I spoke that we are as an organism to make sure that all our cells are playing their part
Mm-hmm.
in trying to optimize our well-being
Yeah.
within the environment that we find ourselves, because that is the
Mhm.
challenging part. We are not yet evolved for the environment that we are in. Our evolutionary
Yeah.
process is still far behind the
Hmm.
Industrial Revolution. All right, we're still. I know you like your carnivore diet and your caveman story. I'm sure we'll agree and disagree on certain aspects of that, but certainly, as in our evolutionary point, we are not designed yet to live with. The smog particles that are in the air. We are certainly
Hmm.
not designed to live with the ultra processed foods that we are being fed and the lifestyles we are being expected to live. And I use that word expected because the corporate lifestyle, I think, is so
Mm.
toxic. Need to live within the corporate environment in order to make money and put the roof over our heads
Yeah.
and pay for our education and all our children's education. So all of that combined. So for me, maybe this is a good, what does it mean to me? Or what do I do about it? Maybe this is the point where I kind of just give you a little bit of kind of my story. I
Yeah.
always say that what I find most people that are in our area in health and wellness and well-being and metabolic health, we seem to all have had an epiphany point at some point. And
Mm.
unfortunately for most of us, that epiphany point is signaled by ill health.
Yeah.
Something goes wrong, and we find ourselves in a really bad situation, and that's what switches us onto this. So for me, um, I I'd been very sporting as a youngster, very big into playing rugby, and as a coastal boy, it was rugby in the winter, it was surf lifesaving in the summer.
Yeah.
Um, and then I broke my collarbone playing rugby at under 21 level. And I took the year off and the next year off and the next year off. And, 12, 15 years of being off went past. In that same period, I entered the workspace in also similar to you into the telecom sector. Um, Lived on the road, traveled, and I just became fatter and fatter and fatter until I became pretty close to obese. I think I peaked out at about 122 kilograms,
Hmm.
which to put that into perspective, I now weigh 85, and I'm probably still, I play front row forward, so I'm not lean. But yeah, and then got diagnosed as being pre-diabetic just in
Hmm.
2005. At the same time, I had my wife fell pregnant unexpectedly with my daughter, and the wake-up call was, if I'm going to be alive by the time this child's 16, I need to do
Mm.
something about it. And that was my wake-up call. Um, but I didn't really know what I was doing, but I made a lot of very, very good decisions without knowing why or that they were good decisions, if that makes any sense.
Hmm.
And the
Hmm.
first one that I did was I realized that I was never going to set myself an outcome-based goal. I was going to set myself a process-based goal.
Yes.
And I can talk more about that if you want to. But basically, the goal that I set to myself at that point was I am going to go to the gym 3 days a week. That's all I'm going to do. I never said I'm going to
Yeah.
change the way I eat. I never set myself a weight target. I never said I was going to lose weight. I was going to change my diet. All I did was I said I'm going to go to the gym a minimum of 3 times a week. And I was fortunate in that the gym that I joined, which was in Randburg in Johannesburg at the time, happened to be part of a spa. So I set myself a nice little reward. The spa had a massage area, etc. And I said, right, if I've been to the gym 3 days in a week, then Friday afternoon I'm going to take myself off for a massage. That's what I
Nice.
that's and that's all I started off by doing. And 3 days a week very quickly became 5 days a week, although my commitment to myself was still only 3 days a week. And I started to lose weight, not huge amounts because I wasn't really changing my diet. I was still eating really, really unhealthily.
Hmm.
But I started to get healthier. I started getting back into playing rugby at a vet's level and a social level. It wasn't, but and I just started the process. In 2006, I made the move from South Africa to the UK to over here. Um, and I continued along that process, but somewhere along the way, I started realizing that diet was really important.
Mm.
So I started looking at and started reading the research. I think I did a little bit like you got into it. I just started reading. I learned about Google Scholar, and that
Yes.
that you could find studies rather than people's impressions on Google Scholar. Um, And I just started reading everything. I wasn't great at critical thinking at that point. I kind of just believed everything. If, these are scientists, so they wrote it and they published it, it's got to be true, right? Um, but I started the process and I dropped myself down to a good sort of weight period. And then I hung there probably about 15 kilograms heavier than what I maintain my weight at now. Um, but I realized that the diet was where we're at, and then I kind of stayed stagnant and managed to hold that weight for about a year or two, and then I started again on the next level,
Mhm.
and continued to take myself through. In 2013, the company that brought me to the UK made me redundant, and my friends and family basically, I just didn't want to go back in the corporate world. I thought the corporate world
Yeah.
was toxic, and it was certainly toxic to me. The alcohol, the socials, the awards evenings, just living on the road, living in hotels. Um, I knew what I was eating was wrong, but I battled to find a way to eat right within the environment that I was
Yeah.
constantly placing myself being placed into. So when I got made redundant in 2013, I just decided I didn't really want to go into the corporate world or back into the corporate world. And I got told by a mate of mine, look, your friends and family are sick to death of hearing you talking about leptin levels and enzymes and whatever it is. You need a wider audience, right? Go and take this passion of yours and make that
Yeah.
into a living. I started a little business. It was a supplement shop here in Northampton called Northampton Nutrition Center. The idea was to sell supplements to bring in some money,
Hmm.
while offering diet advice and helping people.
Hmm.
Um, the second part of that was a really good idea because it built up my confidence in being able to do that. I was putting meal plans together for people and they were losing weight and they were feeling healthy. I was going, bloody hell, I actually know what I'm doing here, maybe.
Nice.
All right. The first part of that was a huge, big mistake because what I didn't realize was that selling supplements had absolutely nothing to do with knowing about nutrition. It was knowing about retail, and I knew nothing about retail.
Yeah.
So I managed to lose my redundancy settlement quite quickly in this shop.
Mhm.
Um, but I closed that down after 2 years, and started just focusing because you don't need a shop when you're working with people.
Mm.
And spent 2 years with as nutritionist for Bedford Blues Rugby Club,
Mhm.
and growing through that, and just that process through that, it got me to a point where I realized that being self-taught meant I could only get work up to a certain level. So at the age of 51, I think it was, I decided to go back to university and actually get a degree. So yeah, in 2018, I started at the University of Northampton, where I did my undergrad. I did a 4-year undergrad rather than three because I hadn't been in
Mhm.
education since 1984, and I
Yeah.
was crap at it then. Uh, so I did a foundation year. I did 3 years as a doing sports and exercise. Also got myself certified as a personal trainer, um, but realized that personal training wasn't where I wanted to be. But in my
Mm.
process, because part of that sports and exercise degree was the nutrition side, which is what really got me. And that's where I fell in love with mitochondria. That's when I realized what
Mm.
bioenergetics was. That's what I realized the difference between our type 1 muscle fibers and type 2 muscle fibers and what they
Mm.
actually meant in terms of mitochondria. And I got into this whole idea of metabolic flexibility.
Mhm.
Um, and that's kind of brought me to where I am now. So I finished the degree, started the PhD. Which brings me on to, I think, the last part of your question, which is what do I do now? I'm a very, very big believer in this concept of metabolic flexibility. I
Okay.
think the thing that makes human beings the apex predator, the apex species on our planet,
Mhm.
is our flexibility. The fact that we can be flexible with what we eat, we can be flexible with what we do, we can be flexible with, and we have plasticity and we have the ability to do things. So, um, the fact that we can consume sugars and derive energy from it and utilize that, the fact that we can store it, but the fact that we can also use something which is in far more abundance, which is fats, to sustain ourselves over long term. And I think that's
Mm.
where we've evolved to. So if you just take a look at where I think we are evolutionarily in
Mhm.
terms of this organism, um, if you think to, I'm going to say caveman times, so probably a little bit closer to now as well from caveman times, carbohydrates, sugars, um, rarely existed for a couple of weeks every year. All right. When the
Yeah.
fruit was on the vine or when the grains were available to us, we would harvest them. So we have evolved to consume those things, to derive as much energy as we can from them, but also gorge ourselves on them to store energy, because when they're gone, sources of energy for the rest of the year are much harder to come by.
Mm.
Not only are they scarce, but they're harder to catch because you then got to hunt.
Yeah.
So hunting involves expending energy. All right. So
Mm-hmm.
you need to have it. So we have been programmed, I'm going to say our mitochondria, but on a cellular level, we are programmed that when we eat sugars, we keep eating sugars, right? As long as they're there for us to eat, sugar makes us hungry, right? It gives us,
Mm.
it gives us energy to bounce off the walls. But whatever we're not using for energy, it'll store away firstly as glycogen within our muscles and our liver. And
Yeah.
when our liver and our muscle glycogen is full, it will store it away as fat, okay, through lipogenesis. And we are made to do that because that fat reserve will then get us through the winter and
Mm.
will fuel us while we're chasing a gazelle, for 4 days across the, the Plateauland,
Yeah.
across the plains. Um, but that system is still programmed that way. It's not programmed to be in an environment where that sugar is available 24/7, 365. All right.
Without
But
the
without,
physical effort
without the hunting.
on the other
Absolutely.
side of it. Yeah.
Absolutely. But we do need both, right? So we do need
Mm.
to be able to have flexibility. So for me, the opposite of metabolic flexibility is metabolic dependency. And I think the problem that we have today is that because of all the sugars in our food, even when we don't think we're eating sugars, all the sugars in our ultra processed food, all the things that
Yeah.
break down to either glucose or fructose, or lactose, but for glucose and fructose predominantly,
Yeah.
means that we've become metabolically dependent on that sugar. For many people have lost the ability to then switch to fat metabolism. And that comes back down to where we started, is that because we've lost that ability to switch to fat metabolism, we've then lost our ability to switch from pro-inflammatory to an anti-inflammatory state. So
So
we're
when you
constantly
say lost the ability, you're talking a short-term temporary hesitancy or resistance within the metabolic processes to switch from one fuel system to another, or do you mean a permanent loss? They're just not capable of getting there again.
I think that's where I think the intermittent fasting comes in, and that's where I think ketogenic diets come in, and carnivore diets. Is I think that we are survivors as a species. We are developed to survive. So take away the sugars, and given time, not too much time, we will pick it up again. We will switch it back on again.
Mm.
We are a use it or lose it creature, in terms of the way things are designed to work. So
Mm.
if we're not using it, we switch it off and we just lock it away. But it doesn't mean it's forgotten. So force our bodies to
Yeah.
adapt, and we'll remember, right?
Yeah.
Genetically, we'll remember. On a cellular level, we'll remember, and we'll switch this back on. And that's why I think that for me is. So people ask me a lot about things like a ketogenic diet. So I don't live a ketogenic lifestyle,
Mm-hmm.
but I try to use a ketogenic diet to get me through time. So I believe that moving more is essential. Being hungry is essential. All right. Putting ourselves
That's
through
actually quite a
controlled
profound
stresses.
thing. And before we move on, let's just touch on that because I certainly had it growing up. No, many people listening and watching will have experienced the same. And I had this very conversation with my daughter this morning. That it's quite brilliant that you brought that up. Being hungry is essential. Like people don't appreciate the fact that you should experience hunger, real physiological hunger, on a daily basis, and that should be your cue for I need to eat now. Like
Yeah.
most people, myself included, I used to run around avoiding hunger at pretty much all costs. I would eat three major meals a day, and I would snack in between because no, you don't want your blood sugar to drop. You don't want to get hungry. Like you're not you when you're hungry. The old Snickers thing. Like
Yeah.
that, you should experience hunger, and you should experience real hunger. I'm not talking about the endorphin feedback loops and sugar cravings. I'm talking about real physiological hunger, and people need to go for a period of time without eating to actually relearn what that is.
I often like to try to take things like concepts like that and put it in ways that a lot of people understand, and it's kind of a fractal what we're talking about. So I'm at the gym regularly. You're at the gym regularly. Hopefully, some of your listeners are at the gym regularly. But if you just think about the process of building muscle, right? What do we do when we go into the gym? The building muscle is a cycle of something called MPB and MPS, right? So you
Hmm.
go to the gym and you go through muscle protein breakdown. You
Yes.
use heavy weight to actually damage your muscles. You break them, right? Then in the 24 hours after the gym, you go through MPS, muscle protein synthesis. That's now where the muscle repairs. And what it does when it repairs is it goes, oh, we had a hard time. We got broken. We need to repair ourselves stronger. And you
Hmm.
get more tissue, and that's what makes your muscles bigger. It's the exact same process. When you make yourself hungry, you're going through a catabolic process that will then, when you feed yourself, stimulate a metabolic process that will make you healthier. I'm being very oversimplified there, and that's not a scientific explanation. That's a kind of a way to explain it. And we do that with everything in life. Um, Actually, before we started this recording of this podcast, I said to you both, I spent, not you, but I spent time in the South African military, my 2 years compulsory service
Yeah.
way back in the 80s. And the catchphrase there was just this, right? You're going to spend basics. During basics, we're going to break you down and then we're going
Hmm.
to build you back up. That's what the military does. We
Yeah.
break you down and we build you up. It's the same process, right?
Yeah.
And that's what being hungry does. That's what being hungry does. It breaks down certain processes so they can repair stronger and better. And that's metabolic health.
Brilliant. I love that explanation. Yeah, thank you. So on a day-to-day basis, so you're not eating in a ketogenic way, but could you describe what your dietary approach would look like?
All right. I'm going to start my dietary approach on a Friday because it works for me, and I'll explain to you
Cool.
why. Right. So I am just for the audience, if you can't tell, I'm saying I'm 58 years old. I'm 59 years old in a week and a half's time, which is a really scary fact. But I still play rugby at a reasonably competitive level on a Saturday. So I live for
Hmm.
my rugby. You can't stop me playing.
That's awesome.
I'll probably die on a rugby field, right?
That's
But
awesome.
that's what I want to do. So I've designed my program in season to work around rugby, but to also work around
Cool.
my age. Right.
Hmm.
So the way my process works is I will start eating carbs and bigger meals on a Friday at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Hmm.
And I'll eat a reasonably big meal with some carbs in it, not a heavy carb meal, but with some carbs in it on Friday night. Saturday morning, I have a heavy carb breakfast,
Hmm.
but certain carbs and grains just don't agree with me. So I used to try doing this with oats, and oats just really, really doesn't work for me. So believe it or not, and I don't know how I'm going to lose all your audience now, but my go-to breakfast on a Saturday morning is a bowl of pap, right? Maize meal, or the Americans would call
Ah,
it grits.
ah,
Okay. So
no.
I have a big bowl of maize meal. I say the South African word is pap, or grits if
Porridge
you're
for
American.
the Brits.
Porridge, yeah, yeah, with bananas and fruit and Greek yogurt and a scoop of protein powder. And I'll have that about 7 in the morning, and
Okay.
that's the last thing I'll eat before a match because I don't like going onto a rugby field with anything in my stomach. So
Mm.
I'll eat that about 7:15, 8:15 in the morning. I will then not eat again. I'll play a match. A kickoff this time of year is 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 2:15 if in the winter months. And then I will eat a high carb meal straight after rugby. And my time from after rugby on a Saturday afternoon up until the time I go to sleep on a Sunday night is my free to eat time. I just eat. That's when I relax. I have a family meal. I'll have dessert. I'm not going to be the pain in the behind that's not eating anything. But I will finish my eating on a Sunday somewhere around 6:37. And then
Hmm.
I will not eat again until 7 o'clock on Monday night. So I do a 24-hour fast from that point. So um any sugars, any glucose that hasn't been restored into muscle glycogen, which now
Hmm.
might be potentially that's going to get burnt up very, very quickly on Monday because I go to the gym Monday morning. So I'm in the gym
Yeah.
at 5:15 in the morning. So I do a gym workout, fully fasted, and I'll stay fasted until Monday night. Then from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, I don't eat until 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So I remain fasted. I do an intermittent feed just until about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on those days. And then I don't eat carbs on those days until the Friday afternoon again. So all my
Okay.
meals from Monday evening until Friday lunchtime are proteins and fats.
I
Um,
like that. Okay. So you've
and
taken the metabolic flexibility and you're putting in place a process and a procedure that allows you to fuel your physical activity on the weekend using carbs for the intramuscular glycogen to make the high intensity rugby easier to fuel. But then you're taking yourself, and then Sunday is your free to eat day, as you've described, which I think most people sort of go after in the whole 80-20 theory. You have that one day a week where you just like that's your day. And then the 24-hour fast, that's pretty cool. So that'll, I don't know if you measure it, but that should, because you're active, that should in theory put you back into ketosis after
Yeah, I
that
don't measure it,
24-hour
but yeah.
period with an exercise session in on a Monday. And then you stay in ketosis, eating sort of fats and proteins, but no carbs for the remainder of the week until Friday. So you're leveraging that metabolic flexibility. So you're in a state of using fat for fuel for the majority of the week, excepting for leading up to your rugby match, where you then switch back over to carbs to fuel the energy requirements of the rugby itself. And then you have your sort of, what will we call it? We'll call it your luxury day
It's
after
it.
that. Yeah.
I don't like to use the word treat because then you sound like you're like I always say, the only people that should be the only creatures that should be rewarded with food are dogs, right? When my dog sits and you give him a treat, right? So why we do it to
Yeah.
our children, I don't know. If you're good,
Yeah.
I'll give you a chocolate. It's just ridiculous, right? But that's personal. Yeah. So basically, within that cycle, I'm using two pretty much accepted concepts. I'm using something called carb cycling.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm backloading my carbs when I need to, other than before rugby. And then I'm also using a sports a protocol, which is the old train low, compete high scenario, right?
Mm-hmm.
So train low, compete high simply says that you train in ketosis, or you train
Mm-hmm.
in a complete carb deficit, and you compete with carbs. And that way, basically, you're basically teaching your body to fuel most of your activity using fats because of the flexibility, but when it needs the carbs, for them to be able to kick in when it's there, right? So if you think about that in maybe some endurance sport, or middle distance running, so just think about a Mo Farah at the 800 meters. I would say that for 550 meters of an 800 race, Mo Farah is fueling himself on fats. All right, he's
Okay.
metabolically flexible. He was when he was competing. He's going fats, fats, fats. 250 meters or so from the end, here comes the kick. Boom, that's when the sugars kick in, right? He hasn't, his glycogen stores have been so well protected for the bulk of the run because he's metabolically flexible that all that energy is available to him when he needs the kick
Yeah.
to be able to do the sprint at the end. Or Keely Hutchinson is probably a more current reference to use for that, and she's got a great kick in the ends of her runs. But even think about a truly metabolically flexible Tour de France cyclist, right? Ideally, you would like to be able to fuel yourself on the flats and the downhills with fats, because you've got an
Mm-hmm.
abundant, even the skinniest person we know has an abundant source of body fat to be able to use
Yeah.
as a fuel.
Yeah. A week's worth.
Yeah, but when you get to the bottom of the Pyrenees and you want to start that big climb, that's when you want to be able to switch into fermentation, right? That's when you want your
Yeah.
glycolysis to kick in, because you want the shorter translation to fuel you up the hill.
Mm-hmm.
Or when you hit the wall, if you're running a marathon, all these different expressions that people use. And then as soon as you get to the top, you want to have depleted all the glycogen in your body when you get to the top of the hill. Go down the hill, have the bit of carbohydrate refuel that the Tour de France cyclists will have, the chocolate or whatever it is. That goes straight back into the glycogen stores, and it waits for that next uphill or the next sprint if you're Mark Cavendish.
Yeah. Now that makes sense. Now, do you think that you could still replenish those glycogen reserves in the absence of exogenous carbohydrate?
Yes, over time. And by time, I'm talking about 24 hours. I'm not talking about a huge amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
So when I worked with professional rugby players, um, we depending on where they were and what they needed to do, the meal that essentially included some carbs was the meal between two training bouts, right? So the guys would generally do an S&C session in the morning, so they would be completely blowing out those glycogen stores
Yeah.
in the gym in the morning. Then they would have lunch, and then they'll be on the field, and they've got another 3 hours of running around, etc. That's where you wouldn't be able to replace the carbohydrates in that lunch break fast enough. but
Yeah.
they do not need the carbohydrates after that second session, because overnight they will naturally replenish those carbohydrates from metabolizing what's available in the body for the morning session again.
Mhm.
So yes, so for me, it's the average person just by eating, because no food is, nothing's a single micronutrient, right? So even a
Mhm.
steak's got some carbs in it.
Mhm.
Okay, they're all there. If you're eating eating some green vegetables, so you've then got obviously your micronutrients, but you've also got your high fiber and your carbs built into that. So you don't need to eat essential carbs. Your body will find carbs where it needs to if you're
Mhm.
not, over a 24-hour period, if you're not flattening them again or
Yeah.
requiring them to flatten again. So yeah, that's why I say I go to the gym at 5:15 in the morning. I don't need carbs. I'll have plenty available for me when I go to the gym at 5:15 the next morning
Mm. No,
for what
that's cool. I did an
what I'm
interesting experiment. I think it was last year. Yes, I think it was last year, where I tend to eat. You've mentioned already. I follow a carnivore-ish lifestyle. It's not through the writing of my book. It's become not strict carnivore because I've started to appreciate the importance of flexibility and the fact that we do, as species, we have that digestive flexibility to include a range of foods. It's not as tribal as the online community tends to become. Certainly, when I started looking into nutrition, it was all about keto, and you had the keto tribe, and you had the paleo tribe, and you got the carnivore tribe, and you got the lion diet tribe, and the vegan tribe over there that we're all at war with. And
Yeah.
it's something about human nature in the online community. It becomes very siloed and tribal. And I've looking at the sort of harder sciences, especially gastroenterology, I've had to appreciate that, well, no, in fact, if you look at the makeup and function of our digestive system, we are in fact made for a range, and it's not one particular thing. But I did an experiment where I went for a week fasting completely, so absolutely no exogenous intake whatsoever other than water and unsweetened black coffee, one in the morning. But I still trained hard, and I do calisthenics, so it's high intensity strength training, and I tend to superset my workouts. I'll do a pull exercise, a push exercise, a core exercise, one after the other, no rest. Then I'll have a rest, and then another round and another round, and then I'll switch them up. And I tracked all of it with my heart rate monitor. And I was surprised to find that my ability to maintain the intensity across the week. So obviously the first day was par for the course because I trained fasted anyway. So day one, there was no real difference to how I would normally train anyway. But then day 2, 3, 4, and 5, like by day 5, I hadn't eaten since Sunday, but it was Friday afternoon. And I was still able to put in the same quality of work as I would have done the week before, where I'd eaten on Thursday night. And we know that high intensity effort is fueled by intramuscular glycogen. And so, what I think must be happening is the mechanism of gluconeogenesis must be adaptable and malleable. And where you place sufficient demand on the body, it will replenish those glycogen reserves using your lipids and your proteins to the level that then is required to sustain the effort that you're putting in.
Right. And potentially, this is where maybe the possible negative comes in. Potentially, it could also been through your muscle protein breakdown, right? So you could have actually been breaking down some of your muscle protein to be able to
Maybe.
refuel at a later point. But it also again depends on level. And another big fuel source that people don't realize is a massive fuel source is lactate, right? So
Mm.
basically, as you're working in that state, your working muscles are producing lactate along with acid with hydrogen ions with acid, but that lactate becomes a fuel source, right? So
Mm.
lactate is not the evil everybody thinks it is. The thing that exhausts you is not the lactate; it's the hydrogen ions, right? It's the acidifying as a byproduct. Lactate is actually there to use those hydrogen ions to try to reduce the effect
Okay.
of acid buildup. It's not so hydrogen ions are causing acid buildup. Lactate is actually being produced. So we measure lactate, as a means of measuring acid buildup, but the lactate is not acid buildup. So lactate actually uses up hydrogen ions, but we pass lactate around. So if I've got one group of muscles that are working really hard and producing lactate, the muscles around that can then take that lactate and use it as a fuel source. And
Nice.
potentially,
Okay.
if all of those are doing it, it'll pass the lactate to your blood. And we know everyone talks about glucose being the brain's primary source. Actually, there's more and more studies now showing that lactate is the preferred source of energy for the brain. But that's a different discussion potentially. But yeah, but you could have been using a little bit. You could have been going through more. Your muscle protein breakdown for that week potentially exceeded your muscle protein synthesis. All right. But I say potentially because, again, it's about adaptation. But if you want to look at this at the end degree, and I wish I had the references in front of me, but there is a group of guys that have done this twice now. They are athletes, but not elite athletes. So they're you and I type athletes.
Recreational athlete. Yeah.
But they did it firstly with a cycle. Yeah, they're recreational athletes, but they did it firstly, but they're also scientists. So they did this first with a cycle thing where they basically did a 5-day fast. So
Hmm.
for 5 days, the only thing that they consumed was black coffee, as you mentioned, water, and when necessary, some salt tablets. And then they
The
cycled
electrolyte.
100
Yeah.
miles a day.
Yeah.
But they measured everything. They were censored up all over the show, and every
Yeah.
single day, all their biomarkers were taken. I did an extraordinary study, and then they repeated that with a run. So about a year later, again, it was a 5-day complete fast, so absolutely no food for 5 days of any sort. I can't remember what the distance was, but again, they ran, I think, something like a marathon a day or something
Mm.
for 5 days, fully fasted. But measuring blood sugar levels all the way, measuring how their bodies were adapted. I will say that to my knowledge, all of them were previously keto adapted, right? So
Yeah, I think
they've all been
that's an important
yeah,
sort of
yeah. So
caveat there. Yeah. Yeah. To be
so they
fat
weren't doing this
adapted.
out. Yeah, so they'd been long-term keto followers, so they were keto adapted, and that is important. I
Yeah.
wouldn't advise anybody just goes and tries that off the bat. Don't try this at home, folks. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it shows that we can, right? It
Mm.
shows that we can, and that probably resembles something back to those caveman days we're talking about. I
Mm.
mean, when you hunting down an animal, across the plains, potentially that's a 5 or 6 day trek, right?
Mhm.
If you just look at the San people, they're around the Limpopo area, they'll dart an animal, but the poison that they use that's a naturally made poison. It takes 4 or 5 days before it brings the animal down, and they will
No,
track
we got
that
to
animal
follow
for
it.
five
Yeah.
days continuously in a fully fasted state,
Yeah.
right? And then bring it home to the tribe. They won't eat until it comes home, and everybody's participating in that.
Yeah.
So that's what we are. That's where our evolutionary point is. Our evolutionary progress is yet to catch up with the world we live in, and it's
So that's actually a very good segue because you mentioned this earlier, but you've looped back around to it, which is perfect. If we take modern lifestyle and we consider, I've done a series for my Substack on what I consider to be the 5 pillars of metabolic health, and what I mean by that is the 5 what I would call ancestrally appropriate stimuli for our metabolic health, and these are nutrition, sleep, movement or exercise, light exposure or solar exposure, and grounding. And if you were to look at modern lifestyle, paying attention to those 5 stimuli, it's actually quite inconvenient to align those properly as part of your lifestyle. You have to make almost dedicated effort to do them correctly because modern lifestyle is so convenience focused that we just seem to have lost the path.
Absolutely, and that comes back to this concept that I said earlier, where I said being in the corporate world is toxic, and I don't mean that from the point of view that we're all working for terrible bosses that hate us and are making our lives miserable. I mean that just the structure of it is toxic for the way that we are evolved to be.
Mm.
Just I know it's not there, but just think about these people that are just working night shifts, right? They're just not seeing any sun because they're people doing
Mm.
long-term work in night shift, right? We go back to back a couple of decades, and the miners that spent all day at the bottom of a mine shaft and never saw daylight, right? Um,
Yeah.
so just being in this world today is counterproductive to our evolution. And now comes the strange part, and this is again just me kind of providing a little bit of opinion rather than hard evidence. But the problem with evolution, in terms of evolution catching up, right, is the things that get passed. What evolution is just simply what works gets passed down to the next generation, right? So
Mm.
the things that don't work ultimately die. But the problem is that the mutations or the damage being done by our lifestyle very often only affects us in terms of our health after our age of being reproductive. All right. So we start
Mm.
to feel these health negatives after the days of having children, right? So the genes needed to be able to live with this lifestyle don't get passed down because the harm isn't being evolutionarily picked up. I don't know if that's a word, because
Mm.
we're still relatively healthy at the price that we're passing on our genes. All right. Um, so so that's a challenge. All right. That's a big challenge because we're not going to get the adaptations that we need to make us healthy in our older years
Yeah.
because that's too late. We've already our children are already there. We've passed, evolutionarily, we're not going to pass those mutations on. The success, or we're going to retain those negative mutations that allow us to make us age negatively, etc. So
Mm.
we need to do something to deal with that. We need to look after ourselves. We need to take those great years when we think we're completely invincible and start to do something to protect ourselves for the older years.
That I
And
mean that's the $1 million sort of thing, isn't it? Like if you can convince the youth whilst they still have the elixir of youth working in their favor, that these are things that they need to be paying attention to and structuring their lives around. I mean, every health coach I've spoken to wishes they had the answer to that particular little conundrum.
well, I don't think there is an answer to that. So either this is where I tend to maybe disagree with so many of the people in our position on social media, is that yes, there's always going to be, and it's a growing number of people who do get it and do
Hmm.
get it early enough, but that's always going to be the minority. And
Hmm.
there's going to be some people that get it, but still can't do anything about it. I go back to what I said earlier about when I was starting to make these changes, I realized that my work lifestyle was not conducive to health. But there
Yeah.
was, as long as I was in that work environment, there was nothing I could do. But let's take that into an even more basic term, right? Let's just take a single parent. Okay. I'm gonna say a single mom, but I'm fully appreciative that, single parents could be male or female. But let's take a single mom who is battling to keep a roof over the head, battling to keep her child fed, working at least one full-time job, possibly another part-time job, and some sort of a side hustle, just trying
Yeah.
to make things all go. Now you're driving home, you've just finished an 8 hour shift, you've got an hour and a half at home where you've got to get those kids sorted out, get them to do their homework if you can, get them bathed, get them to bed, and then
Mm.
maybe do your other job at night. Now you've got two choices in that hour and a half that you've got to spare. You have the choice of going home and cooking a healthy, nutritious meal, all right? Or you go past the
Yeah.
McDonald's on the way home, or you order from Deliveroo. All right.
Yeah.
I cannot fault that parent for taking the other two options. All
The
right.
easier option. Yeah.
They
No,
know
for
it's
sure.
not right. They know it's not good for their kids' health. They know it's not good for their own health. But that's what they need to. And there's the cost involved because you know what? It's
Mm.
cheaper to buy a damn McDonald's than it is to buy healthy food.
It's amazing. Like you think about it, I can't think of another manufacturing industry where the more you process something, the cheaper it becomes to the end consumer. I can't think of a single example outside of
No,
processed food.
it's yeah, and there's lots behind that, but yeah, you're right. The economies of that don't really stack up.
Yeah.
But there you go. So so I think but we are talking about society, all of us. I think, or all of us in the metabolic health space. I think trying to reach those people is beyond us. We'll get some, and
Mhm.
we'll get those that try. But that's where I believe is the responsibility of where the state needs to come in. And I know that this is a
Okay.
very, very political issue, and I'm not saying this for pro or for any political left or right or in between.
Mm.
All right, but I do think we've got to the point where the industrial economic powers, and the food industry, the pharmaceutical industry, potentially, um, the harm that they are causing needs to be regulated, and it can be changed.
Yeah.
And you know what's weird is I've had a good conversation with someone the other day. I'll put this into perspective in a moment. Those industries, in some cases, know that and they want to make a change, right? So here's an interesting one. Um, so we're talking about, they reformulated, or they started the sugar tax, right?
Mhm.
On fizzy drinks. And
Mhm.
that worked really, really well. We know that kids are consuming less sugar in the form of fizzy drinks than they were before that food tax. They're getting it elsewhere, and there's other things happening, of course, um, but the sugar tax, for the most part, seems to have worked in terms of its very small niche that it occupies.
Yeah.
Um, so the question is, how do we then say all the food companies need to regulate the amount of sugar they put in their snacks? No, they won't get rid of it, but how do they change the formulation of that? And there's a great thinking that says that, oh, they're all just evil. And I don't know if I argue with that one. I probably won't to some extent, but there is a counter side to that. So this is strange. I was talking to somebody who used to work in the office of the chief medical officer, used to work in Chris Whitty's
Mhm.
office as a scientific advisor to government. And she was there prior to the last election. So she was there
Mm.
when the Tories were in charge. And now she's there, or she was there, she's left now, but she was there when the new when Labour came into power, right? And she said, weirdly, because the Tories were saying we're not going to implement this because people need to educate themselves and sort themselves out, that whole neolibertarian way
Mhm.
of thinking.
Mhm.
The state can't regulate people. We can't be a nanny state. People must just do it. People must sort themselves out, which is the neolibertarian thinking.
Yeah.
And Labour are maybe embracing the other side. But she said the weird thing was that the food industry was actually begging for this to come into place. And their reasoning was quite simple, is that until it gets legislated, nobody can go first. So if you're Cadbury's and you take
Mm.
out all the sugar voluntarily and you replace it with chocolate that's a little bit less sweet, you're going to lose market share to Nestle.
Yeah.
And if you're Nestle, you're going to do it the other
Yeah.
way around. So both companies know they need to do it, but they can't go first because they'll lose market share. And then their
Mhm.
shareholders will hate them. But if government legislates and says you have to reformulate on this date, then both companies have to do it at the same time, and the playing field is level, and none of them loses market share on that score to the other. So effectively, this lady was saying that on many issues, not all, a lot of
Yeah.
these food companies are actually saying you need to legislate, you need to play the field because none of us can go first. None of us can afford to lose the market share that we will lose if we go first.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
I had never even
Yeah.
considered. She
You wouldn't
told me
even
this.
think of that. Yeah.
I'd
Mm.
never considered that. So yes, I hear people saying, "Oh, the nanny state, you can't force people to eat this, and you can't do that." But if we just make those sort of changes, I think we can. That's how you get to those people, that single mother and people
Yeah. No, I 100%
in their
agree with
corporate
you.
environment.
I think we'd be challenged to find anyone in their right mind who wouldn't agree that the processed food industry could do with regulation towards healthier standards. I think, though, where the biggest pushback would come from, and it's certainly the pushback I would raise personally, is first, they need to understand what healthy looks like. Because at the moment, the eat well sort of guidelines, the classic dietary sort of plate, the food pyramid, all that sort of thing, I think they've got that horrendously wrong from a physiological point of view for long-term overall human health. It's completely at odds with what our physiology requires.
So the wrong person won the original fight, right? So you spoke earlier about the
Mm.
silos, right? So back in the day, you had Ansel Keys with the fat
Yeah,
hypothesis, and you had Yadkin here in the UK with his sugar hypothesis. Yadkin saying sugar was the devil. Ansel Keys saying fat was the devil. Ansel Keys shouted louder. He had the American political system behind him. He completely shut Yadkin down, and our entire health policies got dictated wrongly from the mid 50s because of the Seven Nation study.
yeah,
Interestingly, The Seven Nation Studies wasn't, the Seven Nation Study is the one that actually put the whole fat hypothesis in place, right?
Hmm.
Basically, just for your viewers, very, very briefly, Ansel Keys published this work that said he looked at the diets of 7 different nations and their instances of heart disease within those nations, and those nations that had the lowest fat consumption had the least heart disease. All right. There's many, many, many reasons why that hypothesis is wrong, because what he didn't factor into that was smoking, right? Because
Hmm.
those
Yeah,
countries that had the highest fat consumption also had the highest cigarette consumption.
yeah.
But nobody looked at smoking those. But there was something else that somebody put forward that was quite interesting. And that was that Ansel Keys didn't look at his study over just 7 nations. He looked over his study over 9 nations. And 3 of those nations made his hypothesis wrong. So he just ditched them and
Actually,
used the 7 nation
21.
study. Yeah, yes, something like that. But he just ditched all the
21.
nations that
Yeah.
didn't suit his hypothesis. There comes that
Yeah,
number
he
21.
chose up the data that suited his hypothesis,
Yeah,
which is fraudulent, to be
absolutely.
perfectly blank. Yeah.
Yeah, but that dictated diet policy for the world
Mm.
ever since, right? Because he was so politically connected and he was so part of the American environment, and of course we've kind of followed the American policies in the
Yeah,
rest of the Western world. But as I
unfortunately.
said, the other factor was the smoking. He didn't account for
Yes.
smoking.
Yeah, yeah. It wasn't absolutely right. At the time, it wasn't appreciated that smoking was a tremendous driver of heart disease. Of course, we know that now, but in the 50s, where I think it was on the back of, was it Eisenhower who had a heart attack? I think it was Eisenhower, it might not have been, but it was one of the American presidents had a heart attack, and that spurred absolute panic into trying to figure out what was causing heart attacks. And that's where Ansel came along and sort of got his whole.
Sorry, I'm having a giggle because I'm just thinking if Americans had just stuck to that sort of policy, then maybe they would have gotten rid of guns after Kennedy was shot. But there you go.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh dear. No, no, all good. But yeah, no, so yeah, smoking causes heart disease. Smoking also causes cancer. Smoking causes all sorts of problems. Like we know that now. We didn't know it then, and it wasn't accepted then, and it was sort of it's strange to think that it was such a controversial topic at the time that
Yeah, but
you had.
it's kind of where the food industry is now. I don't think I don't know for sure, but I'm not convinced that the producers of cigarettes and the science at the time didn't know it. I think they probably had a really good idea, but it certainly wasn't going to be put forward. It was if it was put forward at that time, it would have been a conspiracy theory.
Exactly. Yeah. And it also wasn't conducive to good profits. And at the end of the day, it's a business, and a business needs to be profitable. And
Yeah.
yeah, the corporate machine is a mindless, soulless beast. It's just there to
Yeah,
make money.
yeah, and that's legally imposed, isn't it? Because I think subject to correction. This isn't really my field, but I think correctly somewhere around the 50s as well, there was a big court case in America where employees were suing a company for their health for whatever reason. I can't remember the specific details. And the ruling at the end of the day, and it's been the ruling that's in place since, is that the only legal stakeholders that a company is responsible to is their shareholders.
Mm.
So according to American law, companies in America are legally beholden to their shareholders, not to their customers and not to their employees. All right. And that is therefore default law everywhere else, which
Mm.
means that from a legal perspective, corporations are only beholden to their shareholders.
And the
They have
shareholder
nobody
cares about
beholding.
bottom line.
Yeah. And then they'll tell you, but it's your pension scheme in there as well. So we actually care about you. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. Yeah, no, I think I'm in agreement with you insofar as we do need the state to regulate. But I would caveat that to say that first the state needs to learn what they should regulate towards. Because if they were to try and regulate towards the current set of dietary guidelines, I think they could end up doing even worse than what we currently see.
Yeah. So there's a Dr. Robert Naveau's got an interesting expression. He says that we've spent the last almost 100 years in medicine understanding the path that leads to pathogenesis. We now know exactly what it is that makes us sick. What we now need to start investigating is what makes us healthy. We need to know, we need to firstly identify what it means to be healthy. We don't actually have a definition of what is health, a legally binding, this is what health looks like. And so we need to know what that is. Or from a state perspective, you and I probably have a really good idea, but from a state perspective, you need to have because obviously when you're dealing on a population level, it's very different to when you're dealing with individuals, right?
For sure.
So, so they need to say, this is what health looks like. And then they're going to say, right, now we're going to start investing and funding the research that shows us what is the path that leads to health. What do we need to do?
That's probably where the wheels fall off the bus, because as you and I both know, there's not much money to be made in getting people healthy, because what you tend to end up doing is taking them away from all the things that produce money in the current modern secular world.
I think that used to be true. I think there's two motivations for change around that. Not that I'm seeing that the government are doing it, but the one is the cost of healthcare. So that's probably a bigger challenge, a bigger benefit in this country than maybe the US, but obviously the insurance companies and all that would love to see you going to hospital 5 times a day. But in this country where the state's paying for the hospital, where we have the NHS, I think there is a financial benefit to the state of people being healthy. Because there's less, the cost of healthcare is less. We start getting rid of the bed blocking, not because we find beds for people that have been cured, but because we stop people getting into beds in the first place. So I think there's a greater incentive in this country because the NHS is a taxpayer funded organization to try to make people healthy. But also I think we're now starting to see the things where there is potentially profit in driving health. It's not the traditional one, but it's things like my camera, but I haven't got it on. But the smart watches, the Libra things. There's more and more of these things that are now marketable and profitable around health. So I think, I think there's more to come. So it's maybe not the traditional profiteers in terms of the drug companies, etc. But drug companies are, as you said earlier, they're also businesses, right? So if they realize that the market is swinging,
they need to adapt, right? Adapt or go extinct.
I don't see one day we won't be wearing an AstraZeneca health band around our thumb, taking our blood pressure and all of that, right? Of course, it'll be feeding the data straight back to them, but that's also the world that we live in. Okay, so so if they realize that people want to get healthier and people getting healthier means less drugs, they'll find another way to make money there. The money chain will survive. Business,
for sure. For sure. The innovators are still there.
Yeah, but they won't adapt of their own accord because making change is expensive. But government can make people make change. The state can make change within the right space. I'm not saying we need to be monitoring what everybody puts in their mouth and fine everyone for eating a chocolate. That's nonsense. But I do agree with you. We first need to know what is the path to health, and that's really what motivates me very specifically on my PhD. So when you are a government and you're being lobbied all the time, right? You've got think tanks coming up to you. So like this lady that I met through the office of the chief medical officer, saying that lifestyle will reduce the NHS exposure, right? So you got that feedback into the ministers making a decision, but then you've got a representative of a drug company saying, but here is our drug that we've manufactured, and here's the chemical pathway that you take this drug, it turns to this, it makes that change, it does this to you, and that there will mask the symptoms, and therefore the people will remain productive. So there's a chemical pathway. So here you've got a very scientific chemical pathway that looks very impressive. On the other hand, you've got a correlation study that says these 100 people over here changed what they ate and they lived longer and they cost the NHS less, right? There's no chemical pathway there, but there's a correlation. So the science study just looks to the minister, who's not a scientist, right? I can see this. The guys at GSK or AstraZeneca or whoever it might be, they can show me the pathway. That's right there, right? I can see it. So that's kind of fuels my PhD. I want to be able to show a pathway as to how reducing sugar exposure can improve health.
That's brilliant. I like that. Because you're absolutely right. It's you go back to your sort of introduction of Ansel Keys. It's he who shouts loudest, and the most compelling argument, not necessarily the most factual and accurate argument, but the one that seems most convincing, is
Yeah.
usually the one that wins out.
Yeah. But the one that's, I think, that's probably the most convincing is the one that's coming from the most sources, right? So
Mm,
if I can be, this is my personal goal, if I can be one of the sources that stacks up with a whole bunch of other people that are looking at these things,
mm,
um, that takes whoever the current decision maker is at the time that this evidence gets to like a critical mass, where they go, actually, you know what? This is going to save us money. And it's not just the money that it's going to save the state in terms of the NHS, it's productivity, right?
yeah,
So
yeah, it's
we've
work
got
days
we've got
lost and all sorts. Yeah.
yeah, so we've got this weird dichotomy in the country at the moment. They're looking to raise the pension age, right? So we're looking to raise and increase the pension age because we need to reduce the number of aging population. So of people that are not working, they're taking money out of the
Mm,
system but no longer putting money in. We need to reduce that time span. So we do that. And we need to increase the pot of money going into the pension scheme by increasing that. Which is great. I get the fact that we're all living much longer potentially means that I think their pension age should go up. I don't have an issue with that. But it completely falls apart if a third of the workforce stops working at age 61 because they are unable to work from a health perspective,
yeah.
right? Now they're not even getting to pension age.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what the pension age is, they're drawing the stat from the state in the term of benefits and medical and all of this because they just can't be productive. They've got they're diabetic, they're losing limbs, they've got
Mm,
cancer, they're having hip replacement, all of these things just stacking up. So so it doesn't matter how much you increase the pension age if
mm,
half the workforce or a third of the workforce is dropping out for health reasons. So let's get people able to work to the pension age.
yeah.
Let's get them fit and able to contribute uh, to a higher age before we worry about the next bit. And that's where coming back to what you said. That's where understanding what does it mean to be healthy.
Mm,
What is actual health? And I always go back to this, the best example of how we should age, because aging at the moment has become a disease. We age in a diseased
mm,
way. We shouldn't.
yeah.
But if you want to look at the way we should age, and obviously her lifestyle and the money behind it made it easier, but the way I think we should age is the way the Queen aged, right?
Hmm.
Slow decline, very slow decline, and then a sudden drop off, and she died before anybody knew
Yeah.
how sick she really was.
Yeah. I've had
That's
this
how we should.
conversation with
Yeah.
people recently, and I think people need to understand and separate lifespan from health span and
Absolutely.
understand what health span is. Health span is the quality of your health, and you want that to be as high as possible for as long as possible across your lifespan. And it should be pretty much linear. You should be healthy or want to be healthy. And we're not talking about never get a bug, never get flu, or anything like that. We're talking about having a functioning immune system. So when you get your seasonal bugs that you're exposed to, yes, you may catch something, but within a day or two, your immune system has sprung into action, fought it off. You're on the road to recovery, and you carry on.
Yeah.
But you're not slipping into chronic disease in earlier life and then suffering for decades until eventually you sort of expire at the end. You should be healthy, 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 and then at the end.
So health span in our country, I think I stuck this up on LinkedIn not too long ago. Health span in this country has now declined to about 61 years, right? So the
Yeah.
average person in this country lives to be disability free to be 61. The lifespan has stagnated at 85 years in England. So it was increasing because medicine was
Mm-hmm.
keeping alive, but even that's now stagnated. But if you think about that, the last from age 61 till the time you speak, so when your health span drops 85 to
14
when you're
years of
expected to die,
suffering.
for, and those should be the best years of your life, right?
Yeah.
Those are the years where potentially you retire. Hopefully, you've got a little bit of money in the bank. Your
Yeah.
kids have grown up, and you can now spoil the grandkids if you're
Yeah.
lucky enough to have grandkids. You pass the reproductive age, right? So we start becoming a little bit less risky because we're not showing off to girls and girls to boys
Mm-hmm.
and all of this. We've kind of got over all of that, all right? So because reproduction is a high risk thing, right? You look in the animal world, right? Animals
Yeah.
die
Yeah.
to reproduce, right? So we do the same on a different level. Reproductive is a high energy, highly demanding, energetic process. Um, so but those are our best years. And we're
Mm.
spending those years needing someone to help us carry us from the bed to the toilet.
Yeah. It's not right. It's not right. That's not how the human organism should age.
Hmm.
It, yeah.
Yeah. And I hear the argument. I know people saying, yeah, but look, 100 years ago, people didn't live to this because we've been able to control viruses and caveman times. nobody got cancer because they were eaten by a predator before they turned 40. Yeah, I get all of that, and obviously you got an infection and you had no antibiotics.
Yeah.
So yes, modern medicine is brilliant. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I've had many an occasion where if it wasn't for modern medicine, I probably wouldn't be around at my age. All right.
Correct.
I'm fully accepting of that, and I think we need to appreciate the miracle that medicine is for that. But we
Yeah.
can't let that masking of symptoms become the tragedy of destroying our lives.
Mm.
We've developed this modern medicine so that we can live a wonderful long life. But
Yeah.
let's now develop our own health so we can enjoy that wonderful long life within that. I don't want to be the only 58-year-old running around on the rugby field if somebody
Yeah.
else wants to
That's
be.
for
And I'm
sure.
not, to be honest. Um, so but the other thing that do need to appreciate is that, we are, there is a natural decay within us.
Mm.
And what that means is that as we age, maintenance means harder work, right?
Yeah.
So everybody if you've never been a gym rat in your entire life and you're now approaching 50, it's time to go to the gym twice a week, right? You need to start
Yeah.
lifting heavy stuff that's heavy to you, not,
Yes.
you need to, because sarcopenia is real. Uh,
Yes.
you don't use it or lose it. You stop using your muscle mass, it's going to deteriorate.
So
Use it and
sarcopenia
you
for the
maintain it.
audience is muscle loss leading to frailty.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we know, the science shows us that naturally, our bodies will start to ditch muscle mass from about age 35, but after the
Mm.
age of 50, it starts to accelerate quite quickly. But we also know that's plastic. Start lifting weights. You can, in some cases, completely reverse it, and in other
Mhm.
cases, just maintain what you've got. And all it is
Yeah.
twice a week. Go and lift something heavy twice a week. Doesn't have to be in the gym. Just, I don't know, play around in the garden
Yeah.
with this,
Yeah.
whatever it is. But just, so you need to do some endurance work. You need to do the aerobic stuff. Get back to my subject of mitochondria, right? So you need to be walking. You need to be cycling. You need to be running if you can. You need to be doing the endurance stuff as well, and just making yourself breathe hard. Again, we said you need to
Yeah.
go hungry every now and then. You need to breathe heavily every now and then, right? If you got stairs at work, climb them. If you're
Yeah.
on the third floor and you can't climb 3 flights of stairs, climb the first floor for the first few weeks, take the elevator to the top. After
Mm.
that, climb the first 2 floors, take the elevator to the third floor until you can climb all three. And before you do all of that, if you haven't started, just stop by going downstairs, right? Work eccentrically. So,
Yeah.
so stop by what you take the elevator up if you need to, and come down by the stairs. But make yourself breathe hard. So there we go.
Mm.
Two watchwords I'll leave. Oh, no, I won't leave, but two watchwords that people can take away from today. Be hungry every now and then. You need to experience hunger, and you need to make yourself breathe hard and
Mhm.
lift heavy stuff twice a week as you age, and do that. And that, this whole subject, and I know you've posted stuff, and I post stuff, and other
Mm.
people we're involved with, all stuff. It can get really complicated, and we can make it sound really difficult for the lay person. And while that stuff is important, it doesn't have to be. I mean,
Yeah.
there's the big stuff and there's the 1%ers. I would say
Mm.
I go to the gym and I see the guys in the gym and their protein shakes and this and that and whatever. Everybody seems to want to fix the stuff or take the stuff that I call the 1%ers before they've done the macro stuff, the big stuff, right?
Mm.
So they're having a protein shake 15 minutes after they have their workout, but then they're eating shit after that, excuse my language. All right. You know, before that
Yeah.
protein shake is going to have any effect on you, fix your diet, fix what you eat.
Yeah. You
All
don't
right.
even need the protein shake. I mean, I'm Satch, I'm 100 kilos and I'm muscularly bigger than what I've ever been in my life before I turned 40 this August. I don't eat for hours after I've trained. Hours.
Okay.
Like
So
I think we could actually do an entire series on dispelling gym myths because it's such
yeah,
a
yeah,
marketing fueled mythical industry.
yeah.
It's
But the science that drives it is the 1% science. If your diet is 100% on point, if your training program is 100% on point, then having some protein at the right time and the right amount will make a 1% difference or a sub one
yeah,
percent difference.
yeah.
But it's
If you're
not going
going
to.
for Mr. Olympia, competing at the 1% of the 1%, then those marginal fractional differences
Yeah, and
mean
and the same.
things.
And the same applies to all the health stuff. So if you
Yeah,
break it down, if you take all the stuff that we talk about, intermittent fasting, regular exercise, metabolic health, all of those things, you can literally break it down into the three big macro steps. Go hungry every now and then. Make sure you get yourself out of breath every now and then, and lift some heavy stuff every now and then. You do those three things. If you're currently not doing anything for your health, you do those three things. I guarantee you, in a year's time, you'll be 100% healthier than you are today.
absolutely. Absolutely. Neil, we could carry on for hours, my friend. This has been fantastic, and I'm sure we'll have you on
We have.
again. Um, you've already touched on it, but I want to give you the opportunity just to think about it again. And it's a question I like to ask my guests at the end of each episode. Pick one takeaway, one single takeaway that you want to resonate with the audience for them to really think about and ponder over the coming days. What would that be?
Keep it simple. Look through all the fluff. Look through all the stuff that people like myself put out there, because we are interested in the small stuff. And
Mhm.
just look at the simplest things. Remember what I said right at the start. The change of my life was making one process-based goal. Go to the gym 3 days a week. That was it. No outcome based. I didn't say I had to lose weight. I didn't say I needed to change my diet. None of that. Just give yourself a process, something that's a change, and start with that. It doesn't have to be the gym. We spoke about going hungry now and then. Let's say you want to start an intermittent fast. I will say to you, choose 2 days a week. I don't know, Tuesday and Thursday, and say on those 2 days a week, I'm not going to eat until 12 o'clock in the afternoon.
Mhm.
Start with that. Do that 2 days a
Awesome.
week, every single week, and build from there.
Awesome. I also love that I love the way you conceptualize that process rather than a goal, because it's a lifelong journey. It's not like, it's not like fad dieting where you go after a particular target and you destroy yourself, you attain the target, and then you fall right off the bus and sort of get fat again and put it all back on and revert to what you were before.
You can't control the outcome. You can control the process.
Yeah.
Sometimes things just happen in the outcome. We're not all going to lose weight linearly. We're not all going to meet those. Losing weight has so many variables. It's not just about what you eat. There's so many
Mm.
variables that you cannot control
Yeah.
around weight loss, but you can control the process. And if you control the
Yeah.
process, the other things that you want will happen on their own.
Yeah. The aesthetics take care of themselves if you're getting the foundational inputs correct for health. So I like to phrase it as, if you focus on your health and improving your health, the aesthetic goals of wanting to lose some weight, feel better, look better, etc., that all happens by default.
Absolutely. And set your targets where you got room. So as I said, the reason I chose to go to the gym 3 days a week when I started was because I knew at that point I owned my own business in South Africa, and I knew that sometimes I couldn't go to the gym on a Monday. So if
Yeah.
I'd set myself the process of I have to go to the gym 5 days a week, I would have risked
Yeah.
not meeting my process. But by saying 3 days a week, I wanted to go Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but that meant that if I missed the Monday, I had Tuesday to back it up. If I missed the Wednesday, I had Thursday to back it up, and then build from there. So give yourself the space to grow into your change.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time, sir. Have yourself a
Thank you
good
very much
evening.
for having me. And you.
Thanks, everyone.
Hey folks, thanks so much for watching the episode. Hope that you enjoyed it. Hope that you've got an appreciation for the kind of man that Neill is and the type of work that he's doing. Again, I'd really encourage you to please follow the link in the show notes description. It'll take you to the GoFundMe. If you wouldn't mind just have a look. Neill's put a great video there that details what his research project is, what it's looking at, and I think the the downstream ramifications of something like this being completed are immense, and I think it's incredibly valuable. And I would really appreciate if you could find it in your hearts to donate whatever, whether it's a few pounds, whether it's a larger, more substantial amount, whatever it is. No amount is too big, no amount is too small. Every single donation is appreciated, and every single donation helps to help Neill complete this research project, and I believe it is something that can be hugely beneficial to the metabolic health space and the metabolic health movement. Thanks for your time, everyone.